A woman walked into a luxury restaurant wearing a simple dress and was immediately mistreated. They gave her the worst table, served her with disdain, and treated her like she didn't belong. But when she quietly suggested how to perfect the chef's signature dish, jaws dropped. What they didn't know was that she had created every single recipe in that kitchen. Secrets came to light and lives were transformed forever, in ways no one could have imagined. A story of resilience, recognition, and the courage to reclaim what was rightfully yours. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and comment where you're watching from. She arrived wearing a simple dress, her hair hastily tied back and her shoes slightly dirty from the light rain that had been falling that morning. The restaurant was one of the most luxurious in the city, where every detail gleamed with ostentation, where customers wore watches worth more than cars, and where a single wrong look was enough to decide who deserved respect. When she entered, the silence among the waiters was immediate. There was no reservation under her name, no important surname, no companion. Everything about her screamed outsider. She was seated at a table near the restroom, with paper napkins while other tables displayed fine linen. But she didn't complain. She smiled, like someone who knew something the others didn't yet know. The morning rain had stopped, but drops still clung to the tall windows of Bellemont, casting shifting shadows across the marble floors. Margaret Wilson watched the hostess's eyes scan her from head to toe, taking in every imperfection with the precision of a jeweler examining a flawed diamond. The assessment was swift and merciless. Her navy dress, though clean and well-fitted, bore no designer label. Her handbag was leather, but not the kind that announced its price with every glance. Most damning of all, she was alone. The hostess, a woman named Victoria, whose smile never quite reached her eyes, consulted her leather-bound reservation book with theatrical importance. Her manicured finger traced down the pages as if searching for something that clearly wasn't there. She already knew what she would find, or rather, what she wouldn't find. Margaret Wilson wasn't on any list that mattered in this establishment. Behind Victoria, the restaurant hummed with the kind of quiet efficiency that money bought. Crystal glasses caught the light like captured stars, and the soft murmur of conversation from the dining room spoke of deals being made over wine that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week. This was Bellemont, where politicians dined with oil executives, where tech moguls celebrated acquisitions, where the city's elite gathered to see and be seen. Margaret had been standing there for 3 minutes now, watching Victoria's performance with patient eyes. She knew the game. She had once helped write the rules. Finally, Victoria looked up, her expression a masterclass in polite condescension. "I'm terribly sorry, but we don't seem to have a reservation under your name, and I'm afraid we're completely booked today." Her voice carried the apologetic tone of someone delivering bad news while secretly enjoying every moment of it. Margaret nodded, unsurprised. "I understand. Perhaps you have a table for one available?" "I don't require anything special." Victoria's eyebrows lifted slightly, as if the suggestion itself was mildly offensive. The idea that someone without a reservation, someone who looked like they belonged at a chain restaurant rather than Bellemont, would simply ask for a table was almost amusing. She glanced toward the dining room, where several tables sat empty, then back at Margaret. "Well," Victoria said slowly, drawing out the word as if considering a particularly difficult mathematical equation, "I suppose we might have something available, but it would be near the service area, not our most desirable seating." Margaret's smile remained steady. "That would be perfect." The hostess led her through the dining room, past tables draped in cream-colored linen where other patrons barely glanced up from their conversations about market volatility and vacation homes in the Hamptons. The click of Victoria's heels on the marble floor seemed to announce their passage, and Margaret noticed how the waitstaff straightened as they passed, their expressions carefully neutral but their eyes alert. The table Victoria selected was indeed near the service area, positioned awkwardly close to the hallway that led to the restrooms. It was smaller than the others, set with paper napkins instead of cloth, and close enough to the kitchen that the occasional clatter of dishes was clearly audible. It was the kind of table reserved for walk-ins who weren't expected to tip well or return. "Will this do?" Victoria asked, though her tone suggested she hoped it wouldn't. Margaret settled into her chair with the grace of someone who had sat at far better tables and far worse ones. "This is lovely, thank you." As Victoria retreated, no doubt to warn the waitstaff about the woman at table 12, who would probably order the cheapest item on the menu and ask for extra bread, Margaret looked around with eyes that missed nothing. The placement of each table, the flow of the service, the way the light fell across the room during the lunch hour. She had once known every detail of this space by heart. A young waiter approached her table with visible reluctance. His name tag read, James, and everything about his posture suggested he had drawn the short straw. His movements were quick, efficient, but lacking the careful attention that the other tables received. He set down a water glass without making eye contact, and thrust a menu toward her with barely concealed impatience. "Can I start you with something to drink?" he asked, already glancing toward another table where a businessman in a $5,000 suit was gesturing for attention. Margaret studied the menu for a moment, though she could have recited it from memory. The prices had increased significantly since she had last seen them printed, but the descriptions remained largely the same. The same flowery language designed to justify charging $48 for a piece of fish that cost $8 to prepare. "I'll have the pan-seared salmon," she said, closing the menu. "But could you ask the chef to reduce the cooking time by 2 minutes? And perhaps add a touch more acid to the sauce? A splash of white wine vinegar might brighten it up." James stopped writing and looked at her for the first time. His pen hung suspended over his order pad as he processed what she had just said. Customers at Bellamont didn't typically offer cooking suggestions. They trusted the chef implicitly, as they should given his reputation and the premium they paid for his expertise. I'll pass that along," James said uncertainly. Margaret nodded. "And James? You might want to check on table 7. The gentleman there has been trying to get someone's attention for the past few minutes." The waiter's head snapped toward table 7, where indeed a distinguished-looking man was looking around with growing frustration. James hurried away, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and the gentle sounds of the restaurant around her. 20 minutes later, her salmon arrived. It was perfectly cooked, the flesh flaking delicately under her fork, and the sauce had indeed been adjusted. She could taste the extra acid, bright and clean against the richness of the fish. Someone in the kitchen had listened to her suggestions and implemented them flawlessly. As she ate, Margaret observed the intricate dance of the service staff. She watched the way the sommelier approached certain tables with deference while merely nodding at others. She noticed how the busboys cleared some tables immediately while letting others sit with empty glasses for minutes at a time. Every gesture, every glance, every moment of attention was calculated based on perceived status and expected tip. It was a system she had once helped perfect, back when customer service meant ensuring every guest felt valued, rather than sorted into categories of worthiness. But that was before the expansion, before the Michelin star, before everything had changed. Margaret finished her meal slowly, savoring each bite not just for its flavor but for the memories it evoked. This salmon dish had been her creation, developed over countless nights in the test kitchen, when the restaurant was nothing more than an ambitious dream shared between two people who believed they could create something beautiful together. When James returned to clear her plate, she could see the question in his eyes. The kitchen had sent word back about her suggestions, and now he was looking at her with new curiosity. "How was everything?" he asked, and this time his attention was fully present. "Excellent," Margaret replied. "Please give my compliments to the chef. The adjustments were perfect." As James walked away with her empty plate, Margaret noticed him speaking quietly to another waiter, their heads close together in conversation. Word was beginning to spread about the woman at table 12 who knew more about the food than she should have. Margaret left a generous tip, more than the percentage that tables like hers usually received, and made her way toward the exit. Victoria was nowhere to be seen, probably attending to more important arrivals, but Margaret caught the eye of James as she passed. She smiled at him, the same patient smile she had worn when she first arrived. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, and afternoon sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. Margaret paused on the sidewalk and looked back at the restaurant's elegant facade. The brass nameplate gleamed in the light, Bellamont. Below it, in smaller letters, were the words, Executive Chef, Thomas Chen, and Owner, David Morrison. Only one name was missing from that list, and Margaret had been waiting 6 months for the right moment to reclaim it. She walked away from Belmont with the same quiet confidence she had carried when she entered. Behind her, in the restaurant, conversations were beginning to shift. James was telling another waiter about the woman who knew exactly how the salmon should be prepared. Victoria was wondering why someone dressed so modestly had left such a substantial tip. And in the kitchen, Thomas Chen was asking questions about the customer who had suggested adjustments to his signature dish, and been absolutely correct about every one of them. Margaret Wilson was no longer invisible. She had planted the first seed of curiosity, and she knew from experience that curiosity, once sparked, had a way of growing into something much larger. Tomorrow, she would return, and the day after that. Each visit would add another layer to the mystery, another question without an easy answer. But for now, she was content to walk home through the streets of the city, where she had once been half-owner of its most prestigious restaurant, planning her next move in a game that only she knew was being played. The afternoon continued its slow progression toward evening, and inside Bellamont, the lunch service wound down with its usual efficiency. Tables were cleared and reset, the day's receipts tallied, and the staff prepared for the dinner service that would begin in a few hours. But the conversation about the woman at table 12 lingered, spreading from waiter to busboy to chef, growing with each retelling. Margaret Wilson had returned to her world, but she had left something behind in theirs. A question mark that hung in the air like the lingering scent of the herbs that had seasoned her perfectly cooked salmon. And questions, Margaret knew, had a way of demanding answers. 3 days later, Margaret returned to Bellamont. This time, the afternoon rain was heavier, drumming against the windows with the persistence of an unwelcome visitor. She wore a different dress, equally simple, and carried the same worn leather handbag. Her arrival caused the same flutter of judgment from Victoria, the same resignation from the waitstaff who assumed they knew exactly what kind of customer she would be. But James remembered her. When Victoria seated her at another less than desirable table, this one near the kitchen entrance where the constant traffic of servers created a small hurricane of activity, James approached with something approaching eagerness. "Back again," he said, and his tone carried neither surprise nor disapproval. If anything, he seemed curious about what she might order this time. Margaret smiled at him, the same warm expression that seemed to put people at ease despite their initial reluctance to serve her. "The salmon was exceptional last time. I thought I might try the risotto today." "The wild mushroom risotto is very popular," James offered, already writing on his pad. "Actually, I was thinking of the seasonal vegetable risotto. But could you ask the chef to use the carnaroli rice instead of arborio? It holds its texture better. And perhaps finish it with a touch of truffle oil rather than grated cheese." James's pen stopped moving again. He looked at her with the same expression he might wear if she had just started speaking in a foreign language he almost, but not quite, understood. "I'll see what the chef says," he managed. "Tell Thomas that the oil should be applied just before serving, not during the cooking process. He'll understand." The pen slipped from James's fingers and clattered onto the table. He stared at Margaret for a long moment, his mouth slightly open. She had used the chef's first name. Not only that, she had spoken about him with the casual familiarity of someone who knew his cooking style intimately. "How do you know Chef Chen's name?" James asked quietly. Margaret's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in her eyes. A momentary glimpse of sadness, quickly covered but not quite quickly enough for James to miss entirely. "It's on the menu," she said gently. "Right there at the bottom." James looked down at the menu in Margaret's hands, and indeed, there was Thomas Chen's name printed in elegant script. But that didn't explain how she knew his cooking preferences, or why she spoke about him like she had worked beside him for years. When her risotto arrived 30 minutes later, it was prepared exactly as she had requested. The carnaroli rice held its perfect al dente texture, and the truffle oil glistened on top like liquid gold. James watched her take the first bite, saw the way her eyes closed briefly as she tasted it, and noticed something he hadn't seen before. This wasn't the expression of someone trying an unfamiliar dish. This was the look of someone tasting a memory. "Perfect," Margaret said after swallowing. "Please tell Thomas that the technique is flawless." But James didn't leave immediately. Instead, he lingered beside her table, his curiosity finally overcoming his professional reserve. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, how do you know so much about the cooking? I mean, your suggestions last time were spot on, and today you knew exactly how the chef would want to prepare the risotto." Margaret set down her fork and looked up at him. For a moment, James thought she might deflect the question or offer some vague explanation about being a food enthusiast. Instead, she seemed to be weighing something, deciding how much truth to reveal. "I've been cooking for a very long time," she said finally. "When you love food the way I do, you develop an instinct for how things should taste." It was a true answer, but James sensed it was far from complete. There was more to this woman than her simple appearance suggested, and his years of waiting tables had taught him to read people. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had commanded respect in professional kitchens, not someone who merely enjoyed good food. As Margaret continued her meal, James found excuses to pass by her table. Each time, he noticed something new. The way she held her fork with the precise grip of someone trained in proper dining etiquette. How she tasted each element of the dish separately before combining them, evaluating flavors with the methodical approach of a chef. Most tellingly, how she positioned her water glass and silverware with the unconscious precision of someone who had spent years in the hospitality industry. When she finished her meal, Margaret once again left a tip that far exceeded what her table placement and simple order would typically warrant. But this time, she did something else. She asked James to pass along a message. "Please tell Thomas that the risotto reminded me of the one we used to make together in Tuscany. He'll know what I mean." James felt his heart skip. "We used to make together. Not, it reminded me of a risotto I had in Tuscany, or it tasted like something I enjoyed there." She had said we, implying a shared experience with Thomas Chen in what sounded like a very personal and professional context. "Ma'am," James said carefully, "who should I say the message is from?" Margaret stood and gathered her handbag, that same patient smile playing across her features. "Just tell him it's from someone who remembers when food was about more than profits." She left Belmont that afternoon with the same quiet dignity she had displayed during her first visit. But behind her, the questions were multiplying. James delivered her message to Thomas Chen verbatim, and watched the chef's face undergo a transformation that was both subtle and profound. Recognition flashed in his eyes, followed immediately by confusion, and something that might have been concern. "What did she look like?" Thomas asked, his voice unusually quiet. James described Margaret as best he could, noting her simple dress, her graying hair, and most of all, the way she carried herself with calm authority. As he spoke, Thomas's expression grew more troubled. "Did she give you her name?" Thomas pressed. "Wilson. Margaret Wilson." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the plate he had been garnishing. When he looked up, his eyes held questions that James couldn't begin to guess at. "If she comes back," Thomas said slowly, "let me know immediately." The rest of the afternoon shift passed with unusual tension in the kitchen. The other cooks noticed that Thomas was distracted, that he kept glancing toward the dining room as if expecting someone to appear. When questioned, he simply said he was waiting for an old friend to visit, but his tone suggested the friendship might be more complicated than he was letting on. Margaret Wilson had visited Belmont twice now, and each time she had left more questions than answers. The staff was beginning to talk among themselves, sharing observations and theories about the mysterious woman who knew too much about their chef and seemed to understand their kitchen better than most people in the industry. But the most important questions remained unasked. Who was Margaret Wilson really? How did she know Thomas Chen well enough to reference shared memories in Tuscany? And why did her presence seem to unsettle everyone who encountered her, as if she represented something they had been trying to forget? The answers to those questions lay buried in the history of Belmont itself, in decisions made years ago that had shaped the restaurant into what it was today. Margaret Wilson wasn't just a customer who appreciated good food. She was a ghost from Belmont's past, returning to reclaim something that had been taken from her. And she was just getting started. Margaret Wilson returned to Belmont the following week, and this time she wasn't alone in her observations. A new server had been hired, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who bore no relation to the chef despite sharing his surname. Sarah was 23, fresh out of culinary school, and working at Belmont to gain experience in fine dining service, while she saved money to open her own small cafe someday. Unlike the veteran staff, Sarah hadn't yet learned to categorize customers by their appearance or their table assignments. When Victoria seated Margaret at yet another undesirable table, this one wedged between the wine storage area and a pillar that blocked most of the natural light, Sarah approached with genuine warmth. "Good afternoon," Sarah said, setting down a proper cloth napkin instead of the paper ones that had become Margaret's usual place setting. "I'm Sarah, and I'll be taking care of you today." Margaret noticed the cloth napkin immediately and smiled. "Thank you, Sarah. That's very thoughtful. Can I start you with something to drink? Perhaps some sparkling water?" It was a small gesture, offering sparkling water instead of assuming Margaret would want the cheapest option. But Margaret appreciated it nonetheless. "That would be lovely." As Sarah poured the water, she glanced at Margaret's menu selection. "Have you decided what you'd like to try today?" Margaret had been studying the menu, but not for the reasons Sarah might expect. She was looking for something specific, something that wouldn't be listed among the regular offerings. "Sarah, does Thomas still make the autumn squash soup? The one with the roasted chestnuts and sage oil?" Sarah paused, her hand hovering over her order pad. The soup Margaret had just described wasn't on the current menu. In fact, Sarah was fairly certain it had never been on any menu she had seen during her 3 weeks at Belmont. I don't think we have that soup available, Sarah said carefully. Our soup today is a lobster bisque. Margaret nodded, unsurprised. Of course. The autumn soup was always seasonal. Thomas used to make it when the first chestnuts came in from upstate. He would roast them himself, then puree half and leave the others chunky for texture. Sarah's pen had stopped moving entirely. She was staring at Margaret with the same expression James had worn during her previous visits. This woman was describing a dish that didn't exist on their menu, but she was describing it with the detailed knowledge of someone who had watched it being prepared countless times. How do you know about that soup? Sarah asked quietly. Margaret's eyes took on that distant quality again, as if she were looking through time rather than across the restaurant. I used to know this kitchen very well, before it became what it is now. Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Victoria appeared at their table with the smooth glide of someone who had noticed an employee spending too much time with a customer who clearly didn't warrant such attention. Sarah, we need you at table 4, Victoria announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. The Patterson party has arrived. The Patterson party was exactly the kind of group that made Victoria's eyes light up with dollar signs. Tech executives celebrating a successful merger, with expense accounts that could easily result in a bill exceeding $2,000. They were the reason Bellamont existed, the customers who justified the marble floors and crystal stemware. Sarah reluctantly took Margaret's order for the day's fish special and hurried away, but she found herself glancing back at the woman by the pillar throughout the afternoon. Every time she passed Margaret's table, she noticed something new. The way Margaret held her wine glass by the stem, rotating it slightly to release the aromatics before tasting. How she broke her bread with her hands rather than cutting it with a knife, the proper European style that suggested formal training. Most intriguingly, how she seemed to recognize several of the dishes being served to other tables, even ones that weren't currently on the menu. During a brief lull in service, Sarah approached James at the server station where he was polishing water glasses. That woman at table 15, she said quietly. Has she been here before? James looked over at Margaret, who was reading what appeared to be a well-worn cookbook while waiting for her entree. A few times. She's unusual. Unusual how? James set down his polishing cloth and leaned closer. She knows things about the food, technical things. Last week she told me exactly how Chef Chen should prepare a risotto, and when I passed along her suggestions, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Sarah glanced around to make sure Victoria wasn't within earshot. She just asked me about a soup that's not on our menu. Described it like she'd eaten it here before. What kind of soup? Autumn squash with roasted chestnuts and sage oil. She said Thomas used to make it when the chestnuts came in from upstate. James went very still. He had been working at Bellamont for 2 years, and he had never heard of that soup. But something about Sarah's description triggered a memory. Not his own memory, but something one of the older servers had mentioned once. Elena might know about that, he said thoughtfully. Elena Rodriguez had been working at Bellamont for 7 years, longer than anyone except the chef and the owner. She had started as a busser when the restaurant first opened and worked her way up to head server. If anyone remembered the early days of Bellamont, it would be Elena. Sarah found Elena in the break room during the shift change, counting her tips and preparing to head home to her family. Elena, can I ask you something about the restaurant's history? Elena looked up, her expression curious but cautious. In her experience, questions about the restaurant's past were usually connected to gossip or drama, neither of which she had time for. What kind of history? Do you remember a soup with autumn squash and roasted chestnuts? Something Chef Chen used to make? Elena's hands stilled on her money counting. Her expression shifted from casual interest to something much more guarded. Why are you asking about that? The change in Elena's tone told Sarah she had stumbled onto something significant. A customer mentioned it today. She described it in detail, like she'd had it here before. What did this customer look like? Sarah described Margaret as accurately as she could, noting her simple clothing, her graying hair, and most importantly, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence despite being treated poorly by most of the staff. Elena was quiet for a long time, her expression troubled. Finally, she looked around the break room to ensure they were alone, then motioned for Sarah to sit down. That soup was on the original menu, Elena said quietly. Back when we first opened, it was one of the signature dishes actually. Why isn't it available anymore? Elena's expression grew even more guarded. There were changes. About 4 years ago, new management came in, said they wanted to elevate the dining experience. They removed a lot of the original dishes, brought in more expensive ingredients, raised the prices. But why remove a popular soup? It wasn't just the soup, Sarah. They removed everything that reminded people of how this place used to be, before it became about money instead of food. Sarah could hear the wistfulness in Elena's voice, and something else. Sadness, maybe even anger. What was it like before? Elena smiled, but it was a sad smile. It was special. The food was incredible, but it was also personal, like eating in someone's home, if their home happened to have a world-class kitchen. The woman who created the menu, she cared about every single dish, made sure everything had a story, a reason for being there. What happened to her? Elena's smile disappeared entirely. She left. Or maybe she was forced out. Nobody talks about it, but there were rumors. A divorce. Some kind of legal trouble. One day she was here, and the next day it was like she'd never existed. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What was her name? Margaret. Margaret Morrison. She was married to the owner. The pieces clicked into place with the sound of a vault closing. Margaret Wilson, the woman who knew about dishes that weren't on the menu, who understood Thomas Chen's cooking style intimately, who carried herself with the authority of someone who belonged in professional kitchens. Margaret Morrison, the co-creator of Bellamont, the woman whose contributions had been erased from the restaurant's history. But if Margaret Morrison was supposed to be gone, written out of Bellamont's story, why was she back? And why was she allowing herself to be mistreated by staff who had no idea who she really was? Sarah's shift ended an hour later, but she couldn't stop thinking about what Elena had told her. She went home to her small studio apartment and did what any curious person in the digital age would do. She searched for information about Margaret Morrison and Bellamont's early history. What she found was frustratingly incomplete. Food magazines from 5 years ago mentioned Margaret Morrison as the co-creator of Bellamont's innovative menu, praising her ability to blend traditional techniques with contemporary flavors. There were photos from the restaurant's opening, showing a radiant woman in chef's whites, standing beside a distinguished man in an expensive suit. David Morrison, the owner, and his wife Margaret, the culinary genius behind the concept. But the articles stopped abruptly 4 years ago. After that, Margaret Morrison's name disappeared from all coverage of Bellamont. Awards went to Thomas Chen. Interviews featured David Morrison, and the restaurant's success story was rewritten to exclude her entirely. Sarah found one final mention of Margaret Morrison in a small food blog that specialized in industry gossip. A brief item noting that the Morrison divorce had been finalized and that Margaret would no longer be involved with Belmont's operations. The post was dated exactly 4 years ago, around the time Elena said the major changes had been implemented. The next morning, Sarah arrived at work with a new perspective on the woman who had been coming to Belmont and accepting poor treatment without complaint. Margaret wasn't just a knowledgeable food enthusiast. She was the architect of everything that made Belmont special, watching strangers serve bastardized versions of her creations, while her name remained absent from every menu and wall. Sarah's first table assignment that day was Margaret Wilson, who had arrived for what was becoming her regular Tuesday lunch. This time, Victoria had seated her near the kitchen door, where the constant traffic of servers and the noise of food preparation created a chaotic environment that most diners would find unacceptable. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wilson," Sarah said, deliberately using the surname Margaret had given when making her reservation. Margaret looked up, and Sarah could see the slight surprise in her eyes at being addressed with proper respect. "Good afternoon, Sarah. How are you today?" "I'm well, thank you. Can I start you with your usual sparkling water?" As Sarah poured the water, she made a decision that could cost her job, but felt necessary anyway. Instead of the standard lunch menu, she handed Margaret a different list of offerings. "Chef Chen asked me to let you know about today's specials," Sarah said quietly. "He's prepared a few items that aren't on the regular menu." Margaret took the paper Sarah offered, and her expression changed as she read. Listed were 3 dishes that Sarah had researched the night before, dishes that had appeared in the original Bellamont reviews but hadn't been served in years. The autumn squash soup with roasted chestnuts, a braised short rib with barley and root vegetables, a chocolate tart with espresso and cardamom. "How did you know?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know who you are," Sarah replied just as quietly, "and I think it's wrong that you're being treated this way in your own restaurant." Margaret's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. For just a moment, the composed mask she wore slipped, revealing the pain underneath. The pain of being erased, of watching her life's work attributed to others, of being made to feel unwelcome in a place she had helped create. "It's not my restaurant anymore," Margaret said softly. "Maybe not legally, but everything that makes this place special came from you. Elena told me about the early days, and I looked up the old reviews. You built this, Mrs. Morrison. Margaret flinched at the use of her former name, but she didn't correct Sarah. Instead, she looked down at the special menu again, at the dishes that represented years of creativity and passion. Does Thomas know you're doing this? I haven't told him yet, but I think he would want to know you're here. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering. Finally, she looked up at Sarah with an expression that was both grateful and terrified. Order the soup, she said. Tell Thomas that if he remembers how to make it properly, I'll know. And if he's forgotten, I'll understand. Sarah nodded and headed toward the kitchen, carrying with her the weight of a message that could change everything. Behind her, Margaret sat alone at her table near the kitchen door, surrounded by the sounds of the restaurant she had once called home, waiting to see if the man who had once been her protege still remembered the lessons she had taught him. In the kitchen, Thomas Chen was preparing for the lunch rush with his usual methodical precision. When Sarah approached with Margaret's order, he listened carefully to her request for the autumn squash soup, but his hands stilled on his knife when she delivered the accompanying message. She said if you remember how to make it properly, she'll know. And if you've forgotten, she'll understand. Thomas set down his knife and looked toward the dining room, though he couldn't see Margaret's table from his position at the prep station. His face had gone pale, and Sarah could see his hands trembling slightly. Tell me exactly what she looks like, he said urgently. Sarah described Margaret once again, and with each detail, Thomas's expression grew more troubled. When she finished, he was quiet for several minutes, staring down at his hands as if they held answers he was afraid to find. It's her, he whispered finally. After all this time, it's really her. Who is she to you? Sarah asked. Thomas looked up, and Sarah could see years of guilt and regret in his eyes. She's the woman who taught me everything I know about cooking, and I repaid her by staying silent when they tried to erase her from this place. The kitchen around them continued its busy preparation for lunch service, but Sarah felt as if she and Thomas were suspended in a bubble of revelation. The woman sitting at table near the kitchen door wasn't just the former co-owner of Bellamont. She was Thomas Chen's mentor, his teacher, possibly even his friend. And he had watched her contributions be attributed to others without speaking up in her defense. Are you going to make the soup? Sarah asked. Thomas nodded slowly, then began gathering ingredients with hands that gradually steadied as he focused on the familiar task. Sarah watched him work, noting how he seemed to be following a recipe that existed only in his memory. He selected butternut squash with the care of someone choosing diamonds, examined chestnuts for the perfect specimens, and gathered herbs with an attention to detail that went beyond his usual professional standards. As Thomas began the slow process of roasting the squash and chestnuts, Sarah returned to the dining room to check on Margaret. She found her sitting quietly, hands folded in her lap, watching the controlled chaos of lunch service with the practiced eye of someone who understood every movement, every gesture, every moment of timing that went into creating a flawless dining experience. Chef Chen is preparing your soup personally, Sarah reported. Margaret nodded, unsurprised. He always was meticulous about preparation. I taught him that the foundation of any dish begins with the quality of the ingredients and the care taken in their initial treatment. He seems to know you well. I hired Thomas 7 years ago, when this restaurant was nothing more than David's ambitious dream and my detailed recipes. He was talented but raw, full of technique but lacking an understanding of how food should make people feel. I spent 2 years teaching him not just how to cook, but why we cook. Sarah could hear the pride in Margaret's voice, mixed with sadness for what had been lost. What happened between you two? Margaret's expression grew distant again. Nothing happened between us specifically. Thomas got caught in the middle of something much larger. When David decided he wanted full credit for Bellamont's success, Thomas had a choice. Speak up for me and risk his career, or stay quiet and keep his job. He chose survival, and I can't blame him for that. The conversation was interrupted by James, who approached their table with obvious nervousness. Mrs. Wilson, Chef Chen asked me to let you know that your soup will be ready in about 20 minutes. He also wanted me to tell you that he's using the chestnuts from the same supplier in the Hudson Valley that you originally found. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. The fact that Thomas was still using her carefully selected suppliers, even after all these years, meant something significant. It meant he had continued to value the standards she had established, even if he couldn't publicly acknowledge her role in creating them. Please tell Thomas that I'm pleased he remembers the importance of sourcing. As James walked away, Sarah noticed other members of the staff beginning to pay attention to Margaret's table. Elena had arrived for the evening shift and was watching from across the dining room with an expression of recognition and concern. Even Victoria seemed to sense that something unusual was happening, though she couldn't quite identify what had changed. 25 minutes later, Thomas Chen emerged from the kitchen carrying a bowl of soup himself, an unprecedented break from protocol that sent ripples of curiosity through the entire restaurant. He approached Margaret's table with the careful steps of someone walking toward either redemption or condemnation. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly, setting the bowl before her with hands that shook almost imperceptibly. Margaret looked up at him, and for a moment, years seemed to fall away from both their faces. They were teacher and student again, mentor and protege, two people who had once shared a passion for creating something beautiful and meaningful through food. "Hello, Thomas." The soup was perfect. Margaret could tell from the aroma alone that Thomas had not only remembered her recipe, but had executed it with the precision and care that she had demanded of him years ago. The butternut squash had been roasted to achieve maximum sweetness without losing its subtle earthiness. The chestnuts added the proper texture contrast and nutty richness. The sage oil was fragrant but not overpowering, and the seasoning was balanced to enhance rather than mask the natural flavors. She tasted it slowly, aware that Thomas was watching her every expression, waiting for her verdict. It was exactly as she had taught him to make it, perfect in every detail. "It's beautiful, Thomas. You've maintained the standards." Relief flooded Thomas's features, followed immediately by something that looked like shame. "Mrs. Morrison, I need to tell you how sorry I am. For everything. For not speaking up when they removed your dishes from the menu. For not defending your contributions. For letting them rewrite the history of this place without you in it." Margaret set down her spoon and looked at him with the same patient expression she had worn during all their early lessons together. "You were protecting yourself and your career, Thomas. I understand that. I've never held it against you, but I held it against myself. Every day for 4 years, I've regretted my silence." Around them, the lunch service continued, but Sarah noticed that an unusual number of staff members were finding reasons to pass by Margaret's table. Word was spreading through the restaurant that something significant was happening, though most of the servers and busboys had no idea what they were witnessing. Margaret finished her soup in quiet contemplation, savoring not just the flavors but the memories they evoked. She remembered the day she had first created this recipe, working late into the night in the test kitchen while David handled the business side of their restaurant venture. She had been so certain then that they were building something that would last, something that would honor both innovation and tradition. When she was finished, Thomas was still standing beside her table, looking like a man who had more to say but wasn't sure how to say it. "Thomas, sit down for a moment." He glanced around the dining room, clearly aware that his presence at a customer's table was unusual, but he pulled out the chair across from Margaret anyway. "Why are you here?" he asked quietly. "After everything that happened, why come back to this place?" Margaret considered the question carefully. She had been asking herself the same thing for weeks, trying to understand what had drawn her back to Bellamont, and why she continued to return despite the poor treatment she received. "Because this restaurant is built on my recipes, my ideas, my years of work, and I wanted to see if any of that still remained, or if it had all been replaced by something else entirely. And what have you found? I've found that the techniques I taught you are still here. The attention to detail, the respect for ingredients, the understanding that cooking is an act of love, that gives me hope." Thomas leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Then come back. Really come back. Help us return to what this place used to be." Margaret shook her head sadly. "It's not that simple, Thomas. Too much has changed. Too many bridges have been burned. But the staff is starting to remember. Elena never forgot the early days. Sarah here discovered the truth about who you are. James has been telling everyone about your knowledge of the food. People are beginning to ask questions. Questions that David won't want answered." At the mention of her ex-husband's name, Margaret's expression hardened slightly. David Morrison was the one variable in this equation that she couldn't predict or control. He had worked very hard to erase her from Belmont's story, and her return threatened the narrative he had constructed about his own success. "He doesn't have to know you're here," Thomas said desperately. "He rarely comes to the restaurant anymore. Spends most of his time at the other properties." Margaret stood, gathering her handbag with the same quiet dignity she had displayed during every visit. "He'll know, Thomas. David has ways of keeping track of everything that happens here. And when he finds out I've been coming here, there will be consequences for everyone who's been kind to me." She left money on the table for her meal. the same generous tip that had become her signature, and started toward the exit. But she paused beside Thomas, who had also stood and was watching her leave with obvious distress. "Thank you for the soup. It was exactly right. That tells me you haven't forgotten everything I taught you. Mrs. Morrison, please, don't disappear again. This place needs you." Margaret smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "This place survived without me for 4 years, Thomas. It will continue to survive." As she walked toward the exit, Sarah fell into step beside her. "Will you come back?" Sarah asked quietly. "I don't know. Probably not for a while." "Why?" Margaret paused at the door and looked back at the restaurant one more time. At the elegant dining room where customers enjoyed meals based on her recipes. At the kitchen where Thomas Chen continued to prepare food using techniques she had taught him. At the servers who were beginning to piece together the truth about who she was and what she had contributed to this place. Because now that people know I'm here, everything is going to change. And change, in my experience, rarely benefits the people who care most about preserving something beautiful. She left Belmont that afternoon with the taste of perfectly prepared autumn squash soup still lingering on her tongue, and the knowledge that she had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The questions that had been whispered among the staff would become conversations. The conversations would become investigations. And eventually, someone would tell David Morrison that his ex-wife had been visiting the restaurant, sitting at inferior tables, and quietly evaluating the empire built on her foundations. Margaret Wilson walked home through the streets of the city, knowing that her days of anonymous observation were numbered. Soon, she would have to decide whether she was ready to fight for what had been taken from her, or whether some things were better left buried in the past. Behind her, in the restaurant, Thomas Chen returned to his kitchen with new determination. For the first time in 4 years, he began planning changes to the menu that would honor the woman who had taught him everything about cooking with heart instead of just technique. Changes that would remind everyone who walked through Belmont's doors that great food came from passion, not just profit. The afternoon service continued around him, but Thomas was already thinking ahead to tomorrow, to next week, to the possibility that Margaret Morrison might return and find a restaurant that finally remembered where its soul had come from. 3 weeks passed before Margaret returned to Belmont, and in that time, the restaurant underwent subtle but significant changes. Thomas Chen had quietly reintroduced 2 of Margaret's original recipes as daily specials, describing them to the waitstaff as classic preparations, without mentioning their true origins. The autumn squash soup appeared on Tuesdays, and a braised lamb dish with rosemary and pomegranate molasses was offered on Fridays. Sarah noticed these additions immediately and understood their significance. Thomas was testing the waters, seeing if management would notice or object to the return of Margaret's creations. So far, Victoria and the other supervisors seemed pleased with the positive customer response to the new offerings, unaware that they were celebrating the work of the woman they continued to treat poorly. Elena had become an unexpected ally in what Sarah was beginning to think of as a quiet rebellion. During slow moments, she shared more stories about the early days of Belmont, painting a picture of a restaurant that had once been known as much for its warmth as its culinary excellence. Customers had returned not just for the exceptional food, but for the feeling that they were experiencing something personal and meaningful. Margaret had this way of designing dishes that told stories, Elena explained during one of their conversations. The braised lamb was inspired by a trip she and David took to Morocco for their anniversary. The squash soup came from her childhood memories of autumn in Vermont. Every item on the menu had meaning, had heart. Now everything feels calculated for maximum profit. Sarah was beginning to understand that Margaret's absence had changed more than just the restaurant's menu. It had altered the fundamental character of Belmont, transforming it from a place where food was an expression of love into a business where dining was simply a transaction. When Margaret finally returned on a Thursday afternoon in early November, Sarah was ready for her. She had convinced the hostess to seat Margaret at a better table, using the excuse that the reservation system had been updated and certain VIP customers were flagged for preferential treatment. It wasn't entirely a lie. Sarah had created the VIP designation herself and added Margaret's name to the list. Margaret arrived wearing a navy wool coat over a cream-colored dress, and Sarah noticed that she looked tired. There were new lines around her eyes, and her usual composed demeanor seemed strained. Something had changed in the weeks since her last visit. "Mrs. Wilson, welcome back," Sarah said warmly, leading Margaret to a table near the windows where natural light created a more pleasant dining atmosphere. "We've missed you." Margaret's smile was grateful but subdued. "Thank you, Sarah. You're very kind." As Sarah set down the cloth napkin and poured sparkling water, she noticed Margaret's hands were trembling slightly. It was barely perceptible, but Sarah had developed an eye for details during her weeks of observing how different customers carried themselves. "Are you feeling all right today?" Margaret paused in the act of unfolding her napkin. "Just a bit tired. I've had some difficult conversations recently." Sarah wondered if those conversations had anything to do with David Morrison, but she didn't want to pry. Instead, she handed Margaret the menu and waited for her to browse the offerings. "I see Thomas has added some new specials," Margaret observed, and Sarah could hear both pleasure and concern in her voice. "The lamb dish has been very popular. Customers keep asking if it will become a permanent menu item." Margaret's expression grew troubled. "That's wonderful, but Thomas needs to be careful. These dishes have a very specific history, and if the wrong person notices their significance—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. If David Morrison recognized his ex-wife's creations on the menu, there would be consequences for Thomas and anyone else involved in their return. Margaret ordered the lamb, perhaps wanting to taste how Thomas had interpreted her original recipe after all these years. While they waited for the food to arrive, Sarah found herself studying Margaret's face more carefully. The woman who had seemed so composed during her earlier visits now looked like someone carrying a heavy burden. "Mrs. Wilson, can I ask you something personal?" Margaret nodded, though her expression was wary. "Why do you keep coming back here? I mean, I'm glad you do, but it must be painful to see what this place has become." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the bustling street beyond. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and thoughtful. "I keep coming back because I need to understand if what David and I built together was real, or if it was always just his ambition wearing the mask of my creativity. If these recipes, these techniques, these ideas can survive without my name attached to them, then maybe they have value beyond what I gave them." "And what have you concluded?" "That the food has maintained its soul, even if the business has lost its heart. Thomas has preserved the techniques I taught him, and that means something. It means the work we did together wasn't wasted." Margaret's lunch arrived, and Sarah watched her taste the lamb with the same methodical attention she brought to every dish. The lamb was perfectly cooked, the sauce rich with pomegranate molasses and fresh herbs, the presentation elegant but not overly fussy. It was exactly as Margaret had originally conceived it, a dish that honored both tradition and innovation. "It's perfect," Margaret said quietly, and Sarah could see tears forming in her eyes. He remembers every detail. As Margaret ate, Sarah noticed unusual activity near the restaurant's entrance. Victoria was speaking intensely with a man in an expensive charcoal suit, gesturing toward the dining room with obvious urgency. The man's back was turned, but something about his posture suggested authority and displeasure. Sarah felt a chill of premonition. She had never seen David Morrison in person, but she had looked up enough photos online to recognize his silver hair and commanding presence. If this was indeed Margaret's ex-husband, his appearance at the restaurant today couldn't be a coincidence. The man turned slightly, and Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. David Morrison was here, and he was clearly looking for someone. Victoria was pointing in different directions around the dining room, as if describing recent seating arrangements or unusual customers. Sarah's heart began racing. She needed to warn Margaret, but she couldn't do so obviously without drawing attention to their table. Instead, she approached with the pretense of refilling Margaret's water glass. "Mrs. Wilson," she said quietly, "I think you should know that Mr. Morrison has just arrived." Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She didn't look toward the entrance, but Sarah could see her entire body tense. "How does he look?" Margaret asked softly. "Angry. He's talking to Victoria about something, and she's been gesturing toward different areas of the dining room." Margaret set down her fork and reached for her handbag with the calm efficiency of someone executing a well-rehearsed escape plan. "I need to leave. Immediately. There's a service exit through the kitchen. I can show you." Margaret shook her head. "That would only get you in trouble, and I won't have that. I'll use the main exit and hope for the best." She stood gracefully, leaving enough money on the table to cover her meal and a generous tip, then began walking toward the front of the restaurant with the same quiet dignity she had displayed during every visit. Sarah watched with held breath as Margaret moved through the dining room, staying close to the wall and using other diners as partial cover. David Morrison was still deep in conversation with Victoria, his back turned to most of the dining room. Margaret was almost to the door when Victoria's voice carried across the space. "There, that's her, Mr. Morrison." The woman who's been coming in and asking questions about the old menu items? David Morrison turned, and his eyes locked with Margaret's across the dining room. For a moment, both of them froze, and Sarah could feel the entire restaurant hold its breath, even though most of the staff and customers had no idea what was happening. Margaret recovered first. She continued walking toward the exit, her pace unhurried, but purposeful. David Morrison started moving in her direction, weaving between tables with the determined stride of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Margaret, wait." His voice was authoritative but not loud, carrying just far enough to reach her without causing a scene that would disturb other diners. Margaret paused at the door, but didn't turn around. "We need to talk." "No, David. We don't." She pushed through the door and disappeared onto the sidewalk, leaving David Morrison standing in the entrance of his own restaurant, watched by every member of the staff and several curious customers. Sarah could see the frustration in his expression, the way his hands clenched and unclenched as he struggled with the decision of whether to follow her onto the street. After a moment, he turned and strode toward Victoria with the controlled anger of someone who had just been publicly embarrassed. "My office. Now." Victoria paled but followed him toward the back of the restaurant where the administrative offices were located. Sarah watched them go, her heart still racing from the tension of the last few minutes. Elena appeared at Sarah's side, having witnessed the entire encounter from her position near the server station. "This is not going to end well," Elena murmured. "What do you think he'll do?" David Morrison doesn't like to be challenged, and he certainly doesn't like to be reminded of things he'd rather forget. Margaret being here threatens the story he's told himself about building this place on his own. 20 minutes later, Victoria emerged from the office looking shaken. She gathered the senior staff for an impromptu meeting, her voice tight with stress as she delivered new directives. "Effective immediately, we have updated policies regarding customer service and menu inquiries. Any customer who asks detailed questions about recipes, cooking techniques, or the restaurant's history should be reported to management. Any staff member who provides information about proprietary methods or discusses the restaurant's business practices with customers will face immediate disciplinary action." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The new policies were clearly designed to prevent any further contact between Margaret and the restaurant staff. More troubling, they seemed aimed at silencing the growing curiosity about Margaret's identity and her connection to Belmont. "Additionally," Victoria continued, "we will be implementing a more rigorous reservation system. Walk-in customers will need to meet specific dress code requirements and provide identification before being seated." Elena raised her hand. "What kind of identification?" "Credit cards with matching IDs. We need to ensure our clientele meets the standards expected at an establishment of this caliber." The message was clear. Margaret Wilson, with her simple dresses and modest appearance, would no longer be welcome at Belmont. David Morrison was closing the door on his ex-wife's return, using bureaucracy and classism as his weapons. After the meeting, Sarah found herself in the employee break room with Elena and James, all of them processing what they had just witnessed. "He's trying to erase her again," James said quietly, "just like he did 4 years ago." "But this time we know who she is," Sarah replied, "and we know what she contributed to this place." Elena looked around nervously. "You two need to be careful. David Morrison is not someone you want as an enemy. He has connections throughout the city, and he's not above using them to protect his interests. So we're just supposed to pretend we never saw her? Act like she doesn't deserve recognition for everything she created here?" "I'm not saying that," Elena said softly. "I'm saying you need to be smart about how you handle this. Margaret Morrison is a strong woman who's survived being written out of her own story once. But if you try to help her and it backfires, she'll end up paying the price along with you." That evening, Sarah went home with her mind churning. She had witnessed something significant today. A confrontation between two people whose shared history had shaped one of the city's most successful restaurants. Margaret Morrison had created something beautiful, only to have it taken from her by someone she had trusted and loved. Now she was fighting for recognition, not through legal battles or public campaigns, but by quietly demonstrating her continued relevance to the place that had once been her home. David Morrison's response had been swift and decisive. Rather than acknowledge Margaret's contributions or engage with the questions her presence raised, he had chosen to strengthen the barriers against her return. The new policies weren't just about maintaining standards. They were about maintaining a version of history that cast him as the sole architect of Belmont's success. But Sarah had seen something in Margaret's eyes during that brief confrontation. Not defeat, but determination. Margaret Morrison had returned to Belmont for a reason, and a few new policies weren't likely to deter her from whatever she was trying to accomplish. The real question was whether the staff members who had begun to learn the truth about Margaret's role would find ways to support her despite the new restrictions, or whether David Morrison's power and influence would succeed in silencing them. Thomas Chen finished his shift that night, knowing that changes were coming to his kitchen. David Morrison had made it clear that any deviation from approved menu items would result in immediate termination. The specials that had allowed Margaret's recipes to return to Belmont would have to be discontinued, replaced with dishes that bore no connection to the restaurant's original creator. But Thomas also knew something that David Morrison might have forgotten. Recipes could be controlled, but techniques lived in the hands and hearts of the people who learned them. Margaret Morrison had taught him more than just how to prepare specific dishes. She had taught him how to understand food, how to respect ingredients, how to cook with intention and soul. Those lessons couldn't be erased by policy changes or threatened employment. They had become part of who Thomas was as a chef, and they would continue to influence everything he created, whether David Morrison approved or not. As Thomas cleaned his station and prepared to leave for the evening, he made a decision that would have consequences far beyond the walls of Belmont's kitchen. He pulled out his phone and sent a text message to a number he had kept stored for 4 years, but never used. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Thomas. We need to talk. There are things you should know about what's happening here, and decisions that need to be made. Can we meet somewhere private?" He sent the message before he could change his mind, then gathered his things and headed out into the night air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new restrictions, but tonight he had taken the first step toward honoring the woman who had given him the foundation for everything he had accomplished since. Margaret Morrison read Thomas's message while sitting in her small apartment, looking out at the city lights that included the glow from Belmont's windows. She had expected David to react to her presence, but seeing him today had brought back memories she had worked hard to bury. The anger in his eyes, the possessive way he had moved through the restaurant, the immediate implementation of policies designed to exclude her. She typed her response carefully. "Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Washington Square Park, North Bench near the fountain. Come alone." Margaret sent the message and then sat back to consider what this meeting might mean. For 4 years, she had maintained her distance from the restaurant and the people who worked there, accepting her exile as the price of David's cooperation during their divorce. But something had changed in recent weeks. Maybe it was seeing how her recipes continued to bring joy to customers, or watching Sarah's determination to understand the truth, or tasting Thomas's perfect recreation of the autumn squash soup. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired of being erased from her own story. Tomorrow's meeting with Thomas would determine whether she was ready to fight for recognition, or whether some battles were too costly to pursue. Either way, Margaret Morrison was done hiding in the shadows of her own creation. It was time to decide what her legacy would be, and who would be allowed to tell the story of Belmont's true origins. The city hummed around her as evening deepened into night, and somewhere across town, David Morrison was likely planning his next move in a game she was only beginning to understand. But Margaret had advantages he might not expect. She had allies now, people who knew the truth and were willing to act on it. Most importantly, she had something that couldn't be taken away or written out of history. She had the knowledge, skills, and passion that had built Belmont in the first place. And tomorrow, she would begin to decide how to use them. The next afternoon, Thomas Chen arrived at Washington Square Park 15 minutes early, nervous energy making it impossible for him to sit still. He had spent the morning preparing for lunch service while thinking about what he wanted to say to Margaret, how to explain the guilt he had carried for 4 years, and the anger he felt about David's latest attempts to control the narrative. When Margaret appeared, walking across the park with the same composed stride she brought to everything else, Thomas felt a familiar mixture of admiration and shame. She wore a simple gray coat and carried herself with dignity that seemed undiminished by yesterday's confrontation. "Thank you for coming," Thomas said as she settled onto the bench beside him. Margaret studied his face, noting the stress lines that hadn't been there during their earlier working relationship. "You look tired, Thomas. This situation is taking a toll on you." "It's not just this situation. It's been 4 years of knowing I failed you when you needed support the most." Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching families with children play near the fountain. "I never expected you to sacrifice your career for me, Thomas. I understood the position David put you in. But I could have done something. I could have refused to let him take credit for your work. I could have spoken up when food critics asked about the origins of our menu. And what would that have accomplished, other than ending your time at Belmont and ensuring that none of my techniques survived there?" Thomas hadn't considered that perspective before. In his guilt-driven thinking, His silence had been pure cowardice. But Margaret was suggesting that his continued presence at Bellamont had served a purpose, preserving something that would have been lost if he had been forced out along with her. "Is that why you've been coming back? To see if anything of your work remained?" Margaret nodded. "Partially. But also because I needed to understand if what we built together was strong enough to survive without my name attached to it. Whether the ideas had merit beyond my personal investment in them. And what have you concluded? That the food has integrity, but the business has lost its soul. You've maintained the technical standards, but the warmth, the sense of community we tried to create, that's gone." Thomas couldn't argue with her assessment. Bellamont had become exactly what they had once sworn it would never be. A place where money mattered more than meaning, where customers were valued for their ability to pay, rather than their appreciation for exceptional food. "David's implementing new policies to keep you from coming back," Thomas told her. "Stricter dress codes, identification requirements, enhanced background checks for anyone who asks questions about the restaurant's history." Margaret's expression hardened slightly. "He's trying to turn Bellamont into a fortress, protecting his version of history by keeping out anyone who might challenge it. What are you going to do?" Margaret was quiet for several minutes, and Thomas could see her weighing options and consequences. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new determination. "I'm going to stop hiding. For 4 years, I've accepted being written out of Bellamont's story because I thought it was easier for everyone involved. But yesterday, when I saw David's face, when I realized he still felt threatened by my mere presence, I understood something important." "What?" "He knows that Bellamont's success is built on my foundation, and he's terrified that people will discover the truth. His reaction tells me that my contributions can't be erased as easily as he hoped." Thomas felt a spark of excitement mixed with apprehension. "What are you planning?" Margaret turned to face him directly, and Thomas could see a strength in her eyes that reminded him of their early days working together, when she had taught him that cooking was an act of courage as much as creativity. "I'm planning to remind the culinary world who really created the dishes that made Bellamont famous, and I'm going to need your help to do it." The implications of her words hit Thomas immediately. Supporting Margaret's fight for recognition would mean defying David Morrison directly, risking not just his job at Bellamont, but his reputation in the industry. David had connections throughout the city's restaurant scene, and crossing him could effectively end Thomas's career. But as Thomas looked at Margaret, sitting on a park bench where she had agreed to meet him despite the risk to her own emotional well-being, he realized that some things were more important than career security. 4 years of guilt and compromise had taught him that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of corruption. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Margaret smiled, and for the first time since her return to Bellamont, it reached her eyes completely. "First, I need you to document everything. Every recipe I created, every technique I taught you, every innovation that came from my kitchen. We're going to build a record that even David can't deny or dismiss. And then we're going to find a way to share that record with people who understand the difference between authentic creativity and borrowed glory. Food critics, culinary historians, other chefs who value the truth about where great ideas come from." Thomas nodded, his earlier nervousness replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "There's something else you should know. Some of the staff have figured out who you are. Sarah, the new server, she's been asking questions and piecing things together. Elena remembers the early days and she's been sharing stories. Even James is starting to understand that you're not just another customer. Are they safe? I don't want anyone to lose their job because of me. I think they're willing to take that risk. Sarah especially. She's young, but she has strong principles about fairness and recognition. She's been treating you with the respect you deserve despite the policies against it." Margaret considered this information carefully. Having allies among the current staff could be valuable, but it also meant that more people would be at risk if David decided to retaliate. "We'll need to be careful about how we involve them. Any plan we develop has to protect the people who are trying to help." "What about the legal aspects? Don't you have rights to some of the intellectual property you created?" Margaret's expression grew grim. The divorce settlement was very specific about intellectual property rights. "David's lawyers made sure that any recipes or techniques I developed while we were married became joint property. And since I was forced to walk away from the business, he gained effective control over all of it. That seems unfair." "It is unfair, but it was the price I paid for a clean break and the freedom to start over somewhere else. I thought at the time that I could rebuild, create new things, establish myself independently. What happened?" Margaret's voice grew soft with pain. I discovered that David's influence in the culinary world was more extensive than I had realized. Doors that should have been open to someone with my experience and track record remained closed. Opportunities disappeared when potential partners learned about my connection to David Morrison. Thomas felt a new wave of anger toward his employer. It wasn't enough that David had erased Margaret from Bellamont's history. He had also worked to ensure that she couldn't succeed elsewhere. So what changed? Why are you willing to fight now? Margaret looked around the park, at the families enjoying the autumn afternoon, at the city that had once welcomed her creativity, and now seemed determined to ignore her contributions. Because I realized that hiding protects his lies more than it protects me. Every year that passes without the truth being told is another year that my work gets attributed to someone else. Eventually, there won't be anyone left who remembers the real story. And you're willing to risk everything to tell it? Margaret met his eyes with the steady gaze of someone who had finally found her courage after years of doubt. I'm willing to risk everything to reclaim it. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected figure. Sarah Chen approached their bench with obvious hesitation, clearly uncertain whether she should be intruding on what appeared to be a private moment. I'm sorry to interrupt, Sarah said quietly, but there's something you both need to know. Something's happening at the restaurant. Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances. Sarah's presence here couldn't be a coincidence. She must have followed Thomas or somehow learned about their meeting. What kind of something? Thomas asked. Sarah looked around nervously before sitting on the edge of the bench. Mr. Morrison called an emergency staff meeting this morning. He's bringing in consultants to evaluate every aspect of the restaurant's operations. Menu development, service protocols, staff performance, even our supplier relationships. Margaret's expression grew grim. He's conducting a purge, looking for any trace of my influence so he can eliminate it completely. It's worse than that, Sarah continued. One of the consultants is Claire Dubois. Thomas went pale. Claire Dubois was one of the most influential food critics in the country, known for her ability to make or break restaurants with a single review. Her involvement suggested that David Morrison wasn't just trying to erase Margaret's contributions. He was preparing to reshape Belmont's public image entirely. When is she coming? Margaret asked. Next Friday. They're planning a special tasting menu that will supposedly showcase Bellamont's authentic culinary vision. Mr. Morrison wants everything to be perfect. Margaret stood abruptly, her mind clearly working through the implications. He's going to present my dishes as his own creations to one of the most important critics in the industry. If Claire Dubois writes a review crediting David with innovations that came from my kitchen, it will become part of the permanent record. Thomas felt a surge of anger. We can't let that happen. No, Margaret said firmly. We can't. But we also can't stop it through conventional means. David has too much control over the narrative, and Claire Dubois will only see what he wants her to see. Sarah looked between them with growing determination. What if she saw something else? Something David doesn't control? What do you mean? Margaret asked. I mean, what if Claire Dubois met the real creator of those dishes? Not in the restaurant where David sets the rules, but somewhere else. Somewhere you could tell your story directly? Margaret considered this suggestion carefully. It was risky beyond measure. Approaching a prominent food critic without David's knowledge could backfire spectacularly, potentially damaging both Margaret's credibility and Sarah's career. But it was also the kind of bold move that might be their only chance to present the truth before David's version became permanently entrenched. Claire Dubois doesn't know me personally, Margaret said slowly. I've been out of the public eye for 4 years. She might not even agree to meet with me. But she would meet with Thomas, Sarah pointed out. He's the head chef at one of her favorite restaurants. If he requested a private conversation about culinary history and innovation, she might be curious enough to listen. Thomas nodded slowly. And if you happened to be there when I met with her, if the conversation naturally turned to the origins of Bellamont's signature dishes, it could work, Margaret admitted. But the timing would have to be perfect. We'd need to reach her before David's tasting event, but not so early that she has time to warn him about our meeting. I can help coordinate that, Sarah offered. I know people in the industry through culinary school. I can find out where she's staying, what her schedule looks like while she's in the city. Margaret looked at Sarah with new respect. You understand that if this goes wrong, David Morrison will destroy your career in this industry? He has the power and connections to ensure you never work in a quality restaurant again. Sarah's expression was resolute. Mrs. Morrison, I've been watching what happens when good people stay silent about injustice. I've seen how lies can become accepted truth when no one challenges them. Maybe my career isn't worth much in the grand scheme of things, but my integrity is. Thomas felt a profound sense of pride in the young woman who had somehow become central to their resistance against David's historical revisionism. "What would you need from us to make this work?" "Documentation. Everything you can provide about the origins of Belmont's signature dishes. Photos, recipes, notes. Anything that proves Mrs. Morrison's role in creating them." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "I have some materials at my apartment. Not everything, but enough to establish the timeline and my involvement. There are also witnesses who could corroborate my story." "What kind of witnesses?" Thomas asked. "Suppliers I worked with directly. Other chefs who visited our test kitchen during the development phase. Even some early customers who remember the stories I used to tell about the inspiration behind certain dishes." Sarah pulled out her phone and began making notes. "If we're going to do this, we need to move quickly. Claire Dubois arrives in the city on Wednesday, and David's tasting is scheduled for Friday evening. That gives us a narrow window to present our case." Over the next hour, they developed a plan that was ambitious, risky, and potentially explosive in its consequences. Thomas would reach out to Claire Dubois through professional channels, requesting a meeting to discuss the evolution of contemporary American cuisine. He would suggest that she might be interested in learning about some lesser-known influences on current culinary trends. Margaret would compile her documentation and reach out to potential witnesses, building a case that could withstand scrutiny from someone as experienced as Claire Dubois. Most importantly, she would prepare to tell her story with the kind of passion and detail that only someone who had lived it could provide. Sarah would serve as their intelligence gatherer, using her connections to track Claire Dubois' movements and identify the best opportunities for their meeting. She would also help coordinate the logistics of bringing together all the evidence they needed. As they prepared to leave the park, Margaret turned to Thomas and Sarah with an expression that mixed gratitude with concern. "Before we go any further, I need you both to understand something. What we're planning isn't just about getting recognition for my contributions to Belmont. It's about challenging a powerful man who has spent 4 years crafting a narrative that serves his interests. David Morrison doesn't forgive people who threaten his version of reality." "Are you having second thoughts?" Thomas asked. Margaret shook her head. "No, but I want you to be certain about what you're risking before we take this any further. Once we contact Claire Dubois, there's no going back. David will know what we've done, and he'll respond accordingly." Sarah stood up with the confidence of someone who had found her purpose. "Mrs. Morrison, some things are worth the risk. Truth is one of them." Thomas nodded his agreement. "We've all been complicit in David's lies for too long. It's time to set the record straight." 3 days later, Claire Dubois sat in the private dining room of a small bistro across town from Belmont, listening to Thomas Chen describe the collaborative process that had shaped contemporary American cuisine in the city's top restaurants. She had agreed to the meeting partly out of professional curiosity, and partly because Thomas had piqued her interest with references to overlooked influences that had shaped current culinary trends. What she hadn't expected was to find herself face to face with Margaret Morrison, whose name had disappeared from industry coverage, but whose influence Claire was beginning to understand had been far more significant than she had realized. "Mrs. Dubois," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "I want to tell you the real story behind Belmont's signature dishes. The story that's been systematically erased from the restaurant's history." Claire Dubois was a seasoned professional who had heard countless stories about restaurant industry politics, creative disputes, and credit battles. But as Margaret began to speak, supported by Thomas's detailed corroborations and a carefully assembled collection of evidence, Claire realized she was hearing something different. This wasn't just another case of professional jealousy or disputed ownership. This was the systematic erasure of a woman's contributions to one of the city's most celebrated culinary establishments. Margaret described the 18 months she had spent developing Belmont's original menu, working 16-hour days in the test kitchen, while David handled business development and financing. She explained how each signature dish had emerged from her experimentation with traditional techniques and contemporary ingredients, how she had spent weeks perfecting the balance of flavors that had become Belmont's trademark. Thomas provided technical details that only someone who had worked directly with Margaret could know. He described her teaching methods, her attention to seasonal sourcing, her insistence that every dish tell a story that connected diners to the ingredients and the land that produced them. The evidence Margaret had assembled was compelling. Photos from the test kitchen showed her working alongside Thomas and other early staff members. Supplier invoices bore her signature and contact information. Most damning of all were the original recipe cards, written in Margaret's distinctive handwriting and dated months before Belmont's official opening. "Why are you telling me this now?" Claire asked, when Margaret had finished her presentation. "Because tomorrow night, David Morrison is going to serve you a tasting menu featuring dishes I created, and he's going to tell you the story of how his vision and creativity built Belmont's reputation. I want you to have the real story before you hear his version." Claire Dubois had built her career on her ability to recognize authenticity, to distinguish between genuine innovation and calculated marketing. Everything about Margaret's presentation had the ring of truth. From the technical details only a creator would know, to the obvious pain that talking about her erasure caused her. "What do you want from me?" Claire asked. "I want you to ask the right questions tomorrow night. Questions that will force David to acknowledge the reality of how those dishes came to exist. I'm not asking you to take my word over his, but I am asking you to investigate before you write a review that makes his version of events part of the permanent record." Claire nodded slowly. "And if my investigation confirms what you've told me, then I hope you'll tell the truth. Not just about who created what dishes, but about what happens when powerful people are allowed to rewrite history to serve their own interests." That evening, Claire Dubois returned to her hotel room and spent hours researching Margaret Morrison's claims. She contacted suppliers, interviewed former Belmont employees who had moved on to other restaurants, and reached out to culinary colleagues who had known Margaret during her active years in the industry. Every conversation confirmed details of Margaret's story. The suppliers remembered working with her directly on ingredient selection and seasonal planning. Former employees recalled her hands-on approach to menu development and staff training. Industry colleagues expressed confusion about Margaret's sudden disappearance from the culinary scene and David Morrison's reluctance to discuss her contributions. By the time Claire Dubois arrived at Belmont for David Morrison's special tasting dinner, she was armed with knowledge that transformed her understanding of everything she was about to experience. David Morrison had spared no expense for the evening. The private dining room was impeccably appointed, the service was flawless, and the wine pairings were expertly selected. As each course arrived, David provided detailed explanations of his creative process, his inspiration for each dish, and his vision for contemporary American cuisine. The autumn squash soup was presented as David's tribute to New England's agricultural heritage. The braised lamb was described as his interpretation of Mediterranean flavors adapted for American palates. The chocolate tart represented his commitment to balancing traditional techniques with modern presentation. Claire Dubois tasted each dish with the appreciation of someone who understood exceptional cooking. But she also listened to David's explanations with the skepticism of someone who had learned the real story behind their creation. "This soup has remarkable depth of flavor," she commented during the second course. "The technique for achieving this level of complexity must have taken considerable experimentation." David smiled with the confidence of someone accustomed to praise. "It took months to perfect. I spent countless nights in the test kitchen, adjusting the roasting times for the squash, experimenting with different varieties of chestnuts." "How interesting. I understand that Margaret Morrison was quite involved in the restaurant's early menu development. Did she contribute to the evolution of this dish?" The question landed like a stone thrown into still water. David's smile faltered almost imperceptibly, and Claire noticed how his hands tightened around his wine glass. "Margaret was involved in some aspects of the early operations," David said carefully. "But the creative vision, the actual recipe development, that was always my domain." Claire nodded and took another spoonful of soup. "Of course. Though I spoke with your chestnut supplier yesterday, and they mentioned working directly with Margaret on sourcing requirements for this specific dish. They said she was quite particular about the variety and the timing of the harvest." The color drained from David's face. He had not expected Claire Dubois to conduct independent research, and he certainly hadn't anticipated that she would contact suppliers who could contradict his version of events. "Suppliers sometimes have imperfect memories," David said, his voice strained. "They may have worked with Margaret on administrative details, but the creative decisions were mine." As the evening progressed, Claire continued to ask pointed questions that revealed the depth of her research. She inquired about Margaret's role in staff training, her relationships with local farmers, her influence on the restaurant's seasonal menu philosophy. Each question made it increasingly clear that David Morrison's claims of sole creative responsibility were not supported by the evidence. By the time dessert was served, David had largely abandoned his attempts to take exclusive credit for the dishes. Instead, he focused on his role as the restaurant's business leader and strategic visionary, hoping to salvage some credibility from an evening that had gone disastrously wrong. Claire Dubois left Belmont that night with a story that was far more interesting than a simple restaurant review. She had witnessed a powerful man's attempt to rewrite history crumble under the weight of verifiable facts. More importantly, she had confirmed that one of the city's most celebrated culinary establishments had been built on the stolen legacy of a talented woman who had been systematically erased from its narrative. 2 weeks later, Claire Dubois' article appeared on the front page of the food section in the city's most influential newspaper. The headline read, "The Hidden Creator: How Margaret Morrison Built Belmont's Culinary Legacy." The article was exhaustively researched and devastatingly thorough. Claire had interviewed dozens of sources, examined extensive documentation, and presented a compelling case that Margaret Morrison had been the primary creative force behind Belmont's most celebrated dishes. She described Margaret's innovative techniques, her commitment to seasonal sourcing, and her role in training the staff who had made Belmont's reputation. Most damaging to David Morrison was Claire's account of their tasting dinner, where his attempts to claim exclusive credit had been systematically dismantled by evidence of Margaret's involvement. The article portrayed David as a successful businessman who had built his reputation by appropriating his ex-wife's creativity and erasing her contributions from the record. The response was immediate and dramatic. Other food critics began investigating similar stories of women whose contributions to the culinary industry had been minimized or erased. Restaurant industry publications picked up the story, and Margaret Morrison's name began appearing in articles about unrecognized influences on contemporary American cuisine. Within a month, Margaret received offers from 3 different restaurant groups interested in hiring her as a consulting chef or creative director. Publishers approached her about writing a cookbook that would showcase the techniques and philosophies that had made Belmont successful. Food television producers invited her to appear on shows discussing the role of women in professional kitchens. But the most significant change occurred at Belmont itself. David Morrison, facing intense scrutiny from the media and pressure from his investors, announced that he would be taking a step back from daily operations to focus on his other business interests. Thomas Chen was promoted to executive chef and given full authority over menu development and kitchen operations. On a crisp morning in early December, Margaret Wilson walked through the doors of Belmont for the first time since her confrontation with David Morrison. But this time, she wasn't wearing a simple dress and carrying a worn handbag. She wore the crisp whites of a consulting chef, and she carried herself with the authority of someone whose contributions were finally being recognized. Sarah Chen, who had been promoted to assistant manager in recognition of her role in revealing the truth, greeted Margaret at the entrance with a smile that could have powered the entire restaurant. "Welcome home, Chef Morrison," Sarah said, using the title that Margaret had earned but never been allowed to claim. Margaret looked around the dining room where she had once been seated at undesirable tables and treated as an unwelcome intruder. The same elegant space, the same marble floors and crystal stemware, but now filled with staff members who knew her story and respected her contributions. Thomas emerged from the kitchen and approached with the kind of reverence typically reserved for visiting culinary legends, which, Margaret realized, was exactly what she had become. "Chef Morrison, we're ready for you in the kitchen. There are some menu items we'd like your input on." As Margaret followed Thomas toward the kitchen where she had once spent 18 months developing the recipes that made Belmont famous, she reflected on the journey that had brought her back to this moment. The months of being invisible, the gradual revelation of her identity, the decision to fight for recognition, and finally the vindication that came with telling the truth. She paused at the kitchen door and looked back at the dining room one final time. At table 15, where she had once sat near the kitchen entrance, a young couple was sharing the autumn squash soup, discussing its remarkable depth of flavor and wondering about the chef who had created such a perfect balance of seasonal ingredients. Margaret smiled and pushed through the kitchen doors, ready to begin the next chapter of her story. A chapter where her name would appear on menus and in reviews, where her techniques would be taught to new generations of chefs, and where her contributions to American cuisine would be properly recognized and preserved. Behind her, in the dining room, lunch service continued with the seamless efficiency that had made Belmont one of the city's premier restaurants. But now the excellence was built on truth rather than lies, on recognition rather than erasure, on the understanding that great food comes from great people whose stories deserve to be told. Margaret Morrison had reclaimed her legacy not through legal battles or public confrontations, but through the quiet persistence of truth and the courage of people who believed that recognition should be based on contribution rather than power. She had learned that sometimes the most important victories are won not in dramatic moments of conflict, but in the steady accumulation of small acts of honesty and justice. As she tied her apron and began reviewing the preparations for the evening service, Margaret knew that this was just the beginning. There were other women whose contributions had been erased, other stories that needed to be told, other legacies that deserved recognition. But for now, she was content to be back in the kitchen where she belonged, creating dishes that would bring joy to diners and training young chefs who would carry her techniques and philosophies into their own careers. She was home, and her name was finally where it had always belonged, at the center of the story she had helped create. In the weeks that followed, Belmont underwent a transformation that went beyond simple acknowledgement of Margaret's contributions. The restaurant's culture shifted from one focused on exclusivity and status to one that emphasized hospitality and authentic connection with food. Menu descriptions began including stories about the inspiration behind dishes and the techniques used to create them. Staff training incorporated Margaret's philosophy that great service comes from genuine care for the customer's experience, rather than calculation of their potential tip. The changes attracted a new kind of clientele alongside the traditional luxury diners. Young chefs came to eat at Margaret's station and learn from her techniques. Food enthusiasts traveled from other cities to experience the restaurant that had become synonymous with culinary integrity and proper recognition of creative contributions. Margaret established a scholarship program for young women entering the culinary profession, funded by the consulting fees she now earned from restaurants seeking to develop authentic, story-driven menus. She also began speaking at culinary schools about the importance of documenting creative processes and ensuring that all contributors receive appropriate recognition. David Morrison quietly sold his remaining stake in Belmont and focused his attention on his other business ventures. He never publicly acknowledged Margaret's role in the restaurant's success, but he also stopped claiming exclusive credit for its innovations. In interviews, he described himself as the business architect who had provided the platform for culinary talent to flourish, a more accurate if less flattering portrayal of his actual contributions. Thomas Chen thrived in his new role as executive chef, building on Margaret's foundation while developing his own creative voice. He maintained the seasonal menu philosophy and attention to sourcing that Margaret had established, but added contemporary techniques and flavors that reflected his own culinary journey. Most importantly, he ensured that every dish served at Belmont came with proper attribution to its creator, whether that was Margaret, himself, or another member of the kitchen team. Sarah Chen completed her management training and was promoted to general manager, making her the youngest person ever to hold that position at a restaurant of Belmont's caliber. She implemented service standards that emphasized respect for all customers regardless of their appearance or perceived status, ensuring that no one would ever again be treated the way Margaret had been during her anonymous visits. Elena Rodriguez was promoted to head server and began training new staff members in the philosophy of hospitality that had characterized Belmont's early years. She shared stories about the restaurant's history, including Margaret's contributions, ensuring that new employees understood they were part of something with deeper meaning than simply serving expensive food to wealthy customers. On the first anniversary of Claire Dubois' revelatory article, Belmont hosted a special dinner honoring women whose contributions to the culinary industry had been overlooked or under-recognized. Margaret prepared a menu that featured dishes from various periods in her career, each one telling the story of a different lesson learned or challenge overcome. The dinner was attended by food critics, industry leaders, and culinary students. But Margaret was most proud to see the Belmont staff in attendance, wearing their formal service uniforms and participating as honored guests rather than servers. These were the people who had supported her return and made possible the restaurant's transformation from a place built on lies to one founded on truth. As Margaret stood in the kitchen that evening, watching the final plates of her anniversary menu being prepared by chefs who understood and respected her techniques, she felt a profound sense of completion. She had not simply reclaimed her legacy, she had transformed it into something larger and more meaningful than she had originally imagined. The woman who had once sat at inferior tables while her own creations were served without acknowledgement had become a symbol of the importance of recognizing all contributions to creative endeavors. Her story had inspired other women to speak up about their own erased contributions, and her example had encouraged restaurant owners to be more transparent about the origins of their signature dishes. Margaret Morrison had learned that the most lasting victories are not those that defeat opponents, but those that create new possibilities for justice and recognition. She had discovered that true legacy is not about individual credit, but about building systems that honor the contributions of everyone who participates in creating something beautiful. As the evening wound down and the last customers departed into the night, Margaret removed her chef's whites and prepared to head home to her apartment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to mentor young chefs and develop innovative dishes. But tonight, she was content to savor the satisfaction of work well done and recognition finally earned. Margaret Morrison walked out of Belmont into the crisp December air, leaving behind a restaurant that had been transformed by truth and justice. She had proven that authentic contributions cannot be permanently erased, that passionate work eventually finds recognition, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not through conflict, but through the patient persistence of people who refuse to let truth be buried. The streetlights illuminated her path as she made her way home, carrying with her the knowledge that she had not only reclaimed her own story, but had helped create a world where such stories would be less likely to be erased in the first place. Margaret Morrison had found her way back to where she belonged, and in doing so, had ensured that others would be able to find their way as well. The city hummed around her with the energy of millions of stories being lived and created, and Margaret knew that somewhere among those stories were other women whose contributions deserved recognition, other creators whose work had been attributed to others, other voices that needed to be heard. Her fight was over, but the larger battle for justice and recognition would continue. She had shown that it was possible to reclaim what had been taken, to restore what had been erased, and to transform defeat into victory through courage, truth, and the support of people who believed in doing what was right. Margaret Morrison's story was complete, but her legacy would continue in every young chef who learned to document their work, every restaurant owner who gave proper credit to all contributors, and every person who chose to speak up when they witnessed injustice. As she reached her building and prepared to climb the stairs to her apartment, Margaret looked back one final time toward the distant glow of Belmont's lights. Tomorrow, diners would sit at those tables and enjoy meals prepared with techniques she had developed and recipes she had created. But more importantly, they would be participating in a dining experience built on honesty, respect, and the understanding that great food comes from great people whose stories deserve to be told and remembered. Margaret Morrison smiled and went inside, ready to rest before beginning another day of the work she had always been meant to do, creating beautiful food and ensuring that the people who create it receive the recognition they deserve. She had reclaimed her legacy, transformed her industry, and found her way home to the truth that had always been hers to tell.